So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marlen Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez received her degree in clinical psychology from the University of Virginia and directs the Life History Lab, which is focused on understanding how our environments shape our adult brain, especially in childhood. Dr. Gonzalez is also the director of the Community Neuroscience Initiative, which is part of the BCTR. The Community Neuroscience Initiative aims to democratize neuroscience, making it more accessible for all. So did I just answer the question that's on the screen? What is community neuroscience?
Right.
We're going to learn more about it. So let's learn more about community neuroscience with Dr. Marlen Gonzalez.
Thanks, Mike. Okay. This is the first time I've been mic'd in my life, so I hope it's working. So I'm really excited to be here today, also kind of nervous. This is a type of talk that I'm not used to giving, where we really focus more on what kinds of impacts and relationships and also process can come through when we put this weird thing together of neuroscience and community. So my goals today are two, it's actually three. I have to get out of here on time so I can catch a flight. But two, here's three. So the goals are, one, I want to convince you that neuroscience really is a powerful tool for us to really understand ourselves, but also to help us make better choices. And when I say us, I mean at different levels, right? In terms of thinking about, parenting, or thinking about bigger things like, what would it be like to have an educational system that considered neurodevelopment? I really do think it's a powerful tool for everyone. But also, I want to also lay bare that there are inequalities to the access and impacts of this tool. Really what we're trying to do finally is brag about how the Community Neuroscience Initiative at the Bronfenbrenner Center and our amazing partners are really trying to change this and make this more accessible. So I recognize that usually you don't see the words community and neuroscience together. I feel like when you hear the word community, it is about like people helping people. It is about the wider scope of things, and neuroscience can feel reductive, biological, something that you do alone somewhere in a bench, I guess. And I think this is a shame, because literally without our nervous system, none of us would be able to have community at all. It is a huge factor as to why we are the way we are. If our brains were like the brains of, say, like my pet rabbit, who is scared of almost anything, despite the fact never having met a predator in her life. If we were like that and we couldn't trust each other, we didn't have a brain that could actually have us be calm in the presence of someone else, you actually couldn't have community. We'd be loners. So to me, I see these things as complementary and necessary. But I recognize that as I think about myself and sort of my journey here, that I once thought of neuroscience as something out there that had nothing to say about real people in real life and the relationships that we have with each other. And partially it's because I think we do kind of a bad job at one, introducing neuroscience. Often you don't get your first neuroscience course until you are in college, right? That's a completely different entry point than, say, like learning math or learning literature or learning all sorts of other things. And so I want to take you through my journey to see why, for me, community and neuroscience ended up being something that I thought, yeah, this makes sense, and this can actually help make a difference. So a little bit about me. So I got my first taste of neuroscience pretty early. And by pretty early, I mean high school. So like a year earlier than most people get neuroscience. And I was, learning it in the context of psychology. And I just thought, this is the coolest thing. Like the unit that everyone bombed in AP Psych, I was like, yeah, this is awesome. I want to know about the axon terminals and the way that they communicate. This is so cool. And so when I went to my undergrad, I actually ran studies with rats, specifically looking at the way, creating a model essentially of how adolescent use of certain kinds of drugs like MDMA, ecstasy is the street drug, which was seen as just something that was like, it's cool, there's no damage, versus something like cocaine that everyone was like, no, that's terrible. So I was trying to see how adolescent use and how it might actually make it easier to build an addiction to some other substances later on. I won't tell you the results of this because the actual results of this, like the study honors thesis that I did, was that I cried a lot over these little animals. And I was like, okay, this is not my ministry. That's fine. And so I was like, well, but I still care about, youth, about helping people. So I went into social policy. My first job outside of undergrad was actually, of all things, doing some implementation research on a Bush era program, looking at how if you gave low-income folks marriage education, how might that impact the quality of life for the children? Maybe you could prevent divorce and the dissolution of the family, and that would have more resources for them. And as I was doing some research and preparation for a white paper that we were doing, I started looking at neuroscience again. So we were studying relationships, we were studying context and studying poverty. And around that time, around 2009, 2008, these studies started to come out that really merge sort of like what I see of as like public policy concerns with neuroscience. So you don't need to necessarily understand all of what's on here, but essentially looking at the way that like maternal education were related to not just different behaviors, but sort of different neural signatures that were related to distraction. That maternal education above poverty was sort of predicting some of these things, and that you could actually look at certain systems that were doing that. Also interesting and related to what I was working on was this study looking at the fact that if you are under threat of shock, first of all, your brain goes nuts. It's just all of it is going off at once. Just that anticipation is enough. But if you hold the hand of a partner, you actually see these decreased activation in this little area here called the DLPFC, so the dorsal lateral frontal portion of your brain. And this is the area that is involved with many things, but especially like willful self-regulation. It's a lot about agency. So literally you're doing less when you're holding the hand of a partner, both in terms of the way that you feel. Like we subjectively know that when we hold someone's hand, someone we love, mind you, that we feel better. But also this is happening at this neural level. So having come together with this, I was like, oh, there is this neuroscience that actually can say something meaningful that speaks to the kinds of issues that I am interested in terms of ameliorating poverty and really thinking about health equity and all sorts of actually equity at many levels. So then I was like, okay, I'll go to graduate school. And thank you. Some of you are graduate students, I can tell. So after selling a piece of my soul, I became, I guess, this expert or whatever on thinking about especially the way that neighborhoods impacted specific systems. So this striatum is related to reward sensitivity. And of course, you might have heard some of the literature regarding higher risk-taking, higher reward sensitivity, delayed discounting, right? Not waiting for bigger rewards. And all of this is related to some of these contextual pieces. But my work maybe it's because I was who I was or whatever it may be, but I started focusing really on thinking about this as not deficit, but calibration, that the skills that you would need in an affluent context and the skills that you need in a context where you don't have abundance, where you have scarcity, are just different, and that those neural systems are, of course, going to be different. And I thought that this could be useful to people in public policy. And I wasn't the only one doing this kind of work. I was actually at when there was a huge rise on it. So this is the number of publications regarding essentially mostly SES, but a few related factors in concert with neuroscience. So you see this massive growth, especially in that 2015, 2017 area. Thanks, Marissa. So my paper started coming out somewhere around here. But did this do anything? Like really, like what did neuroscience do other than say, it's in the brain? Actually, it did a few things. And there were some studies done on how the presenting evidence, neuroscientific evidence of like individual differences related to whether it was poverty or mental health or whatever it was, that it did a couple of things for people. So one, it's changed some people's mindsets about, oh, maybe it's not your character that determines, if you're going to live in poverty or not, or if you have some social emotional issues, like maybe there's something else that's going on and it has to do with your physiology. Also, we found that aside from like everybody, like the research on SES is so good. Like we know very well that there's a huge gradient in terms of outcomes across health, mortality, across education, that is related to SES. But what was interesting is that using this modality, we also started to really think about like these proximal processes. I mean, people were thinking about it, but it's like tying it with the neuroscience and realizing that this relational stress and maybe the context also of having less resources around, that was actually maybe what was driving some of these differences and how that was related to like mental health outcomes. And then also, we really started to think a lot about how context matters. So it's not just, bad childhood equals bad brain equals bad outcomes, but that it depended really on what else was around you. Not all conditions were the same. And I think this is pretty cool. And it actually there were some interventions that came out of it, and also some public discourse about some of this work. So there was work looking at, hey, maybe what we need to really focus on is the parent-child relationship. And that might help improve the children living in poverty. And that was kind of what that Supporting Healthy Marriage program was kind of getting at, right? Like, oh, well, if we change these relationships between the parents, maybe get them to co-parent better, it would be better for the children. You don't really need neuroscience to tell you that, but it does add more weight, especially when people think that there's like some sort of essentialism in there. Also, this is still going on because it's not fully adopted, but looking at all of the benefits of having high school students come into school later, because we know about their circadian rhythms are different and they need that extra sleep. And that does come from neuroscience and neuroscience research. Like, our structures are not really supporting the developmental neuroscience that is the neural development that is going on. And then we really saw this a lot. There was a lot of things that came out regarding the child's separation in the border. and what that would mean, and thinking about how that impacts physiological systems, how it impacts the brain, what that does in terms of like, what kind of trauma is this and why is it a special trauma? Now, a lot of that is also in understanding that social dynamic and the way, a lot of the way people kind of talk about it, sort of like that social distress and detachment, how it gets under the skin and what are the downstream consequences of that. So it has a lot of promise, and I think it's been more adopted into the discourse. Sometimes it's a bit much, even as a person who fully loves these things. And so there is some really fair criticism of it. So there's the neuroscience of inequality, but there's also inequality in neuroscience. So just thinking more broadly, like who is making the decisions and with what information, right? It's not really the people on the ground floor who are making this information. And I'm gonna take a sip of water. And I wonder about our government's ability to read sometimes, to be honest. So there's a power dynamic that is happening. There's also this interesting thing of like, are some of the research really reflecting people's lived experiences? Even that study that I talked about with holding the hand of the partner, rarely in the kind of that MRI research or human neuroscience research is there context really brought into the room. A person really is more isolated. You're looking at them as they are being distracted by one color ball and then another one that they're supposed to track, right? Like, how is that really related to the lived experiences of individuals? How do you relate it back to what's going on with them? There's also the issues, like on the one hand, saying, hey, this is like, it's in the brain, sometimes helps people like destigmatize things like mental illness or the impacts of poverty. On the other hand, it also, and this is like a strong criticism of this, it also can sometimes then really remove the emphasis on the structural issues that actually create these problems. And then you end up overemphasizing like the social determinants, right? So you end up doing research that is like on prejudice, that feeling, that interpersonal thing, and not necessarily like racism and discrimination, the actual being kept away from important resources that determine much of your life course. And so this is the kind of like criticisms that can reasonably be thrown at the use of neuroscience to change people's life. Like, I think we could do this better. And there's also information inequalities. And when I say across, that is not intelligible. What I mean to say is like across the gamut, there's inequalities in terms of who has access and who creates and who has access to this information. So even in our very field, we have really lots of strong underrepresentation. And this is actually a graph more of like citations and the way things stick together. And there's like a really strong white male dominance, despite the fact that 50% of the trainees are women, only 30% make it to like assistant professor, 20% will be racialized as people of color. It's just a very small slice of the pie. There's also confounds that are built in to our tools. So this is actually something called an EEG cap. It basically measures different wavelengths at the top of your skull, looking at electricity essentially, so we can look at how the neural response. But the thing itself, the machine itself, is actually creates a problem, especially if you have any kind of kinky hair. It's not really great, even with hair like mine. Like it just, you have to work at it in order to not have impedance. Impedance means that like the signal doesn't go through as well. And so even structurally, right, like the creation of this thing, like if EEG were created by African-American folks, like this would have been figured out, right? And in fact, there actually are people who have figured it out, by the way. There are people who are doing prototypes on this, right? Like that's the way it would have been done to accommodate for that, because we would have had to accommodate for hair. So those are built-in things that are hard to move forward, but they also speak to like who was in the ground floor started and how is that continually alienating. The other thing too is that although there is research on the neuroscience of, say, inequality or racial prejudice or whatever it may be, a lot of neuroscience, like across the board, doesn't even report demographics. So we don't even really have a good sense when you look at the wider scope of like who's in these studies, what is the context, and aside from it being like problematic in terms of like just reporting, it also serves to further decontextualize the brain as if it's living in a vat just floating. And of course, we know that it's not. Like, we know that there's this interaction between the environment and your physiological systems and your personality. So this way of doing things just kind of is also just inaccurate. And so we're not reporting that much. When we do report or we focus on minoritized or racialized as people of color, we get a lot of like deficit focus and stigmatization focus. So like a difference automatically gets talked about as a deficit. I see it sometimes where the same sort of result that is done on a predominantly white group gets interpreted one way, especially with SES, but then it will get interpreted another way, depending on who's in the group. And so this is stigmatizing. It's something that is, again, telling people like neuroscience is here to judge you, not here to help you, right? It creates this divide, which is very sad because it's something that I do think is very is useful and that I love and I want to share with others. So how do we make sure that we, one, promote justice, but two, that we make sure that in this balancing act of like the promises, but also the perils, that we're really pumping up the promises and we're really trying to move away from the perils. There's nothing in society that is not touched by inequality and the ways in which our country was built. And so this is not unique to neuroscience. However, its power of persuasion is a double-edged sword. So we need to really think about that. So I had been mulling this over for a while, and then I came to Cornell as an assistant professor. I started thinking about like what it would be like to be like, if you did neuroscience in community with others, like in a democratic sort of way, like what would that be like if I could not just do research on, different neighborhoods, but I could actually like with different neighborhoods. I started really thinking about that. And then I was like, oh, I'm an assistant professor at Cornell. I could like do something. And it's fun to be on that other side, but also there's responsibility. And as always, when in doubt, quote Toni Morrison, as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. Great alumni. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of the dream and then show you more of the thinking as well. So in terms of the dream, so actually, Juan, it's longer. It's a longer thing. What is community neuroscience? So to me, community neuroscience as a whole, not the program that I'm going to present, but as a whole, is an approach. It's an approach that's meant to address the promises and perils, an approach to the way we generate, but also communicate our science. And I'll briefly say this. I think that a neuroscience that is going to promote equity is one that is likely to be ecological. And when I say ecological, I actually don't mean it in the Bronfenbrenner way. I mean it in the like all animals way. All animals and all brains have to contend with their environments. And the reason why, aside from it being really nicely tied in biology, so you can keep going on the line and you get the power from that, it's also, I think there's something so deeply humanizing and like empathy inducing about thinking that me and like slime and slugs, we all got to eat. There are things, there are problems that every living thing in this world has to solve, and we share them. And I think that's powerful. I also think that a community neuroscience needs to be contextual. This is the Bronfenbrenner version of equality. So that's thinking about like the history and thinking about the particular embedded context and what might have been done before. So for example, I'll give you a good example. Let's say these parenting kinds of programs. On the one hand, you can think about parenting programs for, say, low-income mothers who are, single moms. On the one hand, it's like, oh yeah, cool. This is going to help the child. This is going to be great. On the other hand, might there be a reason why she does things the way she does? On the other hand, might this be used as as something to bludgeon people and tell them how bad they are and how they fail to meet some sort of standard? It's always in the way that we do it, obviously, right? Like the devil's in the details, but thinking really deeply about the fact that what you need to survive in one context and what you need to survive in another context may not align with what is the societal ideal of that. And that's okay. That's a tension that we need to have. But I think something that's contextual embraces that tension. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to talk more about, I think there are people who do like really great ecological and contextual work. Where we're particularly weak is thinking about how do we democratize it? In other words, how do we share power and responsibility? Because it's both. And so we have arrived at the bragging portion of this talk. Again, I was like, oh yeah, I'm like a professor at Cornell. You could like do stuff. So first I'm gonna just talk a little bit. So the Community Neuroscience Initiative, yes, our mission is to democratize neuroscience. And by that, what we mean is make it accessible, make it translational, and make it inclusive. A democratized neuroscience is one that speaks to people with minimal jargon, applies to their lived experiences, and destigmatizes mental illness and neurodiversity. I think this is what we're trying to do with CNI. We want people to be able to just, even outside of the questions of inequality, to geek out. I just like sharing what I love. And you want to share it with, you just want to share it with somebody else. Like, look at this really cool thing that I found. Did you know, like that, it's just a wonderful thing to love knowledge and to love to understand the world better. We also, however, still want it to be meaningful and useful to others, at least at some point or sometimes, right? And this can go no further than, being an extra argument that supports some already well-known research on like income redistribution, for example. Like it can be helpful in that way, or just in the rhetoric, or it can be more deeply meaningful. And then, of course, with inclusivity, one of the powerful things for me about neuroscience is, as part of biology, you really understand that diversity is the rule, not the exception. It's like it's a feature, not a bug. It's how we persist as a species. And I think that we can, doesn't that sound more cuddlier? Doesn't that sound more like community, right? Like embracing. And I think it is. That's the way that I look at it. So who is CNI? So aside from myself, I got the chance to talk about this with Professor Eve DeRosa and Adam Anderson, who were already doing a project of their own with community in Engage Cornell, and I'll talk briefly about that, and who also were excited about, maybe bringing their neuroscience out into the communities more. So Eve and Adam run a lab that looks at brain and also heart dynamics when it comes to affect, so emotions and emotion regulation, things that like people really care about, but also looking at like disease models and neurodegeneration, and really trying to bring in like the lack of diversity in Alzheimer's research is a serious problem that they're also trying to address. And then I got to tell you, 3 neuroscientists doing community research, nothing could go wrong, right? I'm just really glad that Senegal is here. So Senegal is our CNI graduate fellow. He has a background in public policy and really knows his stuff, like works for, is part of the advisory board for the My Brother's Keeper Alliance, which of course is part of the Obama Foundation. And he has been a godsend. In fact, some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I found out that he actually like drafted up these programs. So, wow, we're lucky. Okay. Okay, we also have our wonderful coordinator, who we share with ARC, Geneva, and then we have also lots of volunteers. This doesn't actually encapsulate all of them because they're never necessarily all in one room at once. This is actually from a reading day that we did for one of our partner schools, where we just like raided the place and started reading to really cute kids. And it was really, it was more of a community building kind of experience. Okay, where is CNI? So for the most part, we're really working in Syracuse. Syracuse is predominantly has a lot of poverty, and in fact, it's #1 in child poverty for a city its size. It also has some statistics as like the leading place also where you have gun violence with children against children, which is really sad. So it's this place that has like, it's a really cool place of, like many towns, has been hit by a lot of the structural changes that have happened in terms of like, you know, factories being taken away. And we really want to reach out, like they're our neighbors, you know, they're like 1 hour away. And we thought, you know, we need to like put our resources here too. And maybe it doesn't sound as cool as New York City, but it's like, that's our buddy. It's right over here. We care about this space. So, okay, great. So we got the who, we got the where, and now we want the how. So how? What does democratizing neuroscience actually look at? So we think about it and as 3 sort of overarching components. One is neuroeducation, so making the research accessible to people en masse, but also, you know, like literally it can be understood. Also some neuroconsulting, so we get sometimes explicit like questions from partners of whatever it may be, whether it's like, hey, we really want to know about video games and the brain, or we really want to know about the developmental neuroscience of like neighborhood crime, for example. And then we also really want to build, we talk about neurocommunity. So things like that reading day and some other things that I'm going to talk to you about, it's just literally about being in space with our partners without necessarily having like some little goal or something, but rather to just be with each other. And we think that that can be more and more generative as things go on. So these are some of our lovely people. This is actually an event that happened on Saturday with teachers and trainers, and they're what makes all of this happen. So let's dig in a little bit. Neuroeducation. So what we did for neuroeducation this past year, we really started in 2022, like in earnest. And we had a collection of neuroscientists who really care about community, really care about accessibility. They're doing their own work, their own things, and all the beautiful places that they're at. But they also, not only did they say yes, but they were stoked to come in on a Saturday afternoon to give accessible neuroscience talks. specifically targeting things that are especially related to education. So thinking about sleep, the neuroscience of sleep, that was Gina Poe, distraction and memory with Andre Fenton, who's a riot. Kelly Duncan did one of the most beautiful and accessible lessons on neuroplasticity and how like traumatic brain injuries work. It was like masterful. Kevin Jones doing some things on perception and the way perception can shift, and really tying it in with neurodiversity, especially with diseases like schizophrenia. And then Dominique Preacher, who, you know, this is too niche, I think, but a lot of the times when people do like motor work, you know, they get relegated like, oh, it's the boring stuff. And then you realize that it is essential for almost anything. Like, why is it that babies, like, if you teach a baby sign language, right, they communicate really well, actually. And it actually increases their emotional regulation. Like, there's all sorts of things that are related to just using gross motor function in order to communicate. But what stops them from really communicating really well is that it's really hard to move your tongue in these very specific ways in order to make sounds. So motor coordination is actually huge when it comes to many facets of our life. We just end up not thinking about it too much, unless, of course, we lose something on the way. So these wonderful people came in and really made these accessible neuroscience lessons, and definitely want to do more with that, and hopefully do some sort of conference with them. Some of the best neuroscience lectures that I've ever seen, honestly, just masterful. This is, Gina Poe made this because she did it with sleep, and I just thought it was the coolest. It's the shape of a brain, but she's got every animal sleeping. Talk about ecological work. It's like everybody sleeps. It's like true. Literally, you gotta sleep. Every mammal's gotta sleep. You gotta sleep. An animal has to sleep. And we need to respect that, that's part of our phylogenetic inheritance, and we need to understand it. So aside from doing the actual lectures, we then have another piece where we do this curriculum, creating curriculum that is accessible to elementary school kids, and using art, so a STEAM approach. So not just STEM, but STEAM, adding art, so that you go home with something like this cute little Play-Doh brain. But they're actually learning about what like the different lobes are. And this one was called a me muncher, and it communicated how your brain is attached to essentially your personality and how who you are is part of that. So we do this in partnership with the My Brother's Keeper Teaching Opportunity Corps. If you don't know about that, it is funding essentially individuals who want to go into the teaching profession, especially from underrepresented groups. And so we thought, hey, this is like so in line, the multi-layers at which like we want to be part of this. And they do an amazing job. We thought we were going to get like, yeah, we could probably get like 30 pre-service teachers or something. We got 7, and that's a good thing. Because the other thing about this talk is I'm going to talk to you about some lessons that we learned, and they're phenomenal, and they can do quite a lot. So we have that. We have the lectures, and the teachers actually attend the lectures. Then we meet on another week on Saturday, and then we come up with like some sort of activity or lesson plan that is appropriate for elementary school students. Then they actually go and give those lessons. So remember I said that Eve and Adam had their own thing going before even CNI was alive. So in the before times, for the pandemic, they actually worked with Pride Scholars in order to do this kind of neuroscience education intervention. And so they were learning about, again, different psychological concepts that are really interesting to teachers and in the educational context. So we're talking about emotion regulation, we are talking about memory, right? All these things that people really care about. And what's really interesting is they did it in a scaffolded way where it was like Pride Scholars would work with high school students in Syracuse, and then they would all go to the elementary school and then deliver all of the lessons. And as they did this, it was actually, you know, they did some manipulations and of like different ways, like talking about purpose or talking about like kind of a grit sort of thing. And they had this other one where it was like super biological. So it's like, I'm going to explain to you different psychological processes, really leaning in on the biology part. And it turned out like they just thought it was going to be like, you know, just like the control condition. But it turned out that the kids who received this like more, they all had some biology, but had like the more biological explanations for psychological concepts, they actually improved more, specifically if they were lower performing students. They had a higher increase in their math and English scores, which I thought was cool and weird. But we wanted to like do more, essentially. So then there's like the Brain Days Part 2, which is what we're doing right now. So those teaching opportunity core teachers, or scholars is what we call them. They come in, so they created their lesson, and then they are now the ones who are empowered to teach. And this is a kind of train the trainer model, right? So we've had 7 teachers kind of come in and out of the CNI, and 4 teachers are like, have consistently done these lessons since November. And you know, you can look at that and you can be like, oh, it's only like 4 teachers or 7 teachers or whatever, but the impact that they have is enormous because of all of the kids that they're going to see. So this was one way in which we thought, oh, we could scale this rather than having Cornell undergrads do this or being beholden to like us being in the room. Maybe there's some way that we can develop a program where it goes out into the wild and then teachers do most of the work in society, it seems. Can really carry that through. So we've seen around 100 kids really we served through them. And we have 2 schools. One of them is called SEAM and Dr. King Elementary, beautiful school. And another one is the Seymour Dual Language Academy. And this was really interesting because they delivered this curriculum or these lessons in both English and Spanish. And it was like we knew, but we didn't know until we saw it. When you really see a teacher talking to a group of 4th graders and they're going back and forth, and you know, the teacher might speak in Spanish, but the kid is speaking English, or the teacher speaks English, but then Spanish, and it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to me because I speak Spanish, but it makes sense. And it was just so beautiful to see because we didn't, when we created the curriculum and we were practicing and stuff, we didn't even think about that. And they just did it on the fly. It was actually like a teary moment for me. I'm not gonna lie. Truly talking about like making things accessible. So the big question then is like, yeah, but can teachers really teach neuroscience? Preliminary evidence, but yes, students seem to really enjoy these lessons. I think partially because of the art, but also they get really excited about neuroscience. So the last time that we did something, we showed them a video of neurons like firing and connecting with each other. And they were like, what? That's inside my head? Yeah, if you ever lose your love for something, to just tell a kid about it and then you'll just get it right back. And scholars are building confidence over time. This is not pretty, but what we are doing is also collecting data on how much they like it using just the kind of a visual analog scale with smiley faces, liking, how much they think they learn, their learning efficacy. So kind of getting at that like self-conception, because maybe the reason why the kids who had the sort of the biological expression was because they were like, oh, I know brainy things, therefore I must be smart. I wondered whether that was part of it. And then what's actually really neat is that over time, you do see more like they're actually getting the answers right. So we actually test them on what they learn and they're getting better over time. The ones to compare the most are lesson 2 and lesson 3 because they're the exact same groups and people. Lesson 1 was a little bit different. Okay, so I realized there's the time. Okay, so as we did these things, again, thinking about neuro community, we were talking with these teachers and we were learning more about their lives. And one of the things that we learned was that they were deeply eaten by guilt and stress, guilt for like even taking time for themselves. And from that, with the funding and help from Hope Lab, Eve and Adam ran another program that was going to use mindfulness-based stress reduction and also a purpose intervention. So thinking about purpose in their lives as a way of like, maybe if we reduce stress, we can also get them in touch with like, why are you doing this anyways? What is your sense of purpose in this context or in any context? And so this just happened last Saturday, but I thought this quote was really cool. It was said in Spanish, actually. I knew I needed this. This gave me permission to take time for myself and focus on what I think, not what others think. And there were there was just a lot of, they talked about having a safe space to be able to talk about some of the things, some ambivalence or some other things that were hard about being a teacher and carrying this like strong sense that everything was on you, that you needed to save the world basically through the children. And it's just something that came out of just talking to people, being in concert. So some reflections. Hello, Milan. I think this shows like, so I want to stress the importance of like listening kind of first. So remember that the Brain Days project first started as like, we go in, we do the work, but it was actually in like almost a year. So several months long conversations with different levels of the New York State Board of Education and also the Syracuse superintendent and schools, that they were like, no, we want teachers to know this. That was them. That was talking to them that got in there. Same thing with the second project that we did, the Roots framework, was because they were like, this is a thing that I need. I'm upset about these things. Work moves at the speed of trust. Lots of meetings, lots of talking, really important. And also partnerships over projects. Like I said, we did something where we were just went in there to read. Because why? Because that school is our partner and they needed it. Other things that neuroscientists will then learn is things like transportation really matters. Getting people from one place to another changes what happens in any of these different projects. Food really matters, like a lot. I know that NIH, somebody somewhere bought like a yacht or something someday at some point with NIH money, and now none of us can have food, which is crazy because if you want to reach especially low income people, like you have to feed people for God's sake, and childcare. And then the thing that I really liked on just a personal level is like, people seem to really like neuroscience if you make it accessible. If you just bring them in and attach it to the cool things that they already like, they really care. And that is genuinely really fun for me. So it's a win-win-win-win-win. So what's next? So we want to focus on growth and sustainability, expanding actually who gets to see the lecture series. We're even going to put them online, and building some other things like fellowships. I didn't talk about neuroconsulting, but I want to make that much more, probably make it into a course, maybe an Engage Cornell course where we could actually get sort of requests for like, hey, what about the neuroscience? What does neuroscience say about X, right? And then with the neuro community, we've been in the process of creating a community advisory board for Syracuse. And then also because they think of everything, in the same space that we have been meeting with our partners, there is also plans to build an interactive like brain neuroscience museum. I realize sometimes when I say brain, people think that they're going to be like taking brains out of a vat or something, but it's things that use art and installations in order to teach neuroscience, but also to have space for community members to be able to hang out, right? Those third spaces are really important. And I think that's it. Science is a team sport. And I just want to thank all the beautiful people who have, been part of this. Thank you so much. Sorry, I went over.
Thanks, Marlen. If there is a question, we probably have time for one, maybe two. I was going to say, please do it fast.
Sorry. Couldn't see the time. It wasn't on presenter view.
Great talk, loved it. We talked before about this, just this idea that there's some value, at least in theory, of being able to help people understand the neurobiological basis of some kind of common experiences they have, or common situations or dilemmas that kind of everybody faces. And, that has might have some practical
Yeah.
value for them. Maybe it might help them
Mhm.
act more wisely in a situation, or have a different perspective, in the moment. And do you have any anecdotes, or even done any research on, you had called it cognitive distance, having some cognitive distance?
Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I often point to is actually working with kids who have phobias. So the sort of protocol of working with kids who have phobias is you externalize the phobia. It's like, oh, it's the anxiety monster that's getting you. And what you need to do is fight the anxiety monster. Nothing will get an 11-year-old boy to think that you're terrible than trying to infantilize them. He was like, it's just, and actually neuroscience and talking about like the amygdala, which is no less an externalization as like the monster or whatever, it's an abstraction, was the hook. And it was okay to talk about it in this way. I do think also with neuroscience and thinking like, sometimes we have this idea that we should be able to go, and that we're not meeting certain expectations. If you take stock of like, have you eaten yet? What's your sleep like? And you really understand that like, no, this stuff does not work well if you don't eat and sleep. Like it is non-negotiable. I think there is something about that, there's this permission that comes in also of like knowing that you are an animal and that your systems need certain things, regardless of what you might want to do with that. Hope I answered your question.
I love everything you were talking about. I'm curious about this nuance of essentialism, and right, like how do you avoid, like it seems like you're suggesting kids naturally don't treat their brain as like their fingerprint that will never change and dictates. But I'm curious, it seems like you could think that it would if you didn't sort of, like as a teacher, if you sort of said, oh, this is your brain, so you got this brain, so this is what your life is going to be like. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, that's general, all like, any kind of biological determinism, right? So it's in the same kind of like determinism thing. But man, does the brain kind of like really refute that in terms of how incredible, like how much incredible neuroplasticity there is. Some of the best findings in the last 30 years of neuroscience has been, we really thought that like age 21, it was over, it was done. It was like, there's no plasticity, right? Like we're done. And then now we're like, oh crap, actually the brain is consistently like rearranging itself and, calibrating to its environment, with the caveat that it is true that it is more plastic in earlier development. So I think understanding that it's an interaction between the environment and your physiology, and knowing that helps you see the brain as this thing that's just trying to solve problems for you. Just like, oh, this is the thing you need, or that is the thing you need. And sometimes like what you need is sleep. And that's why you can't pay attention in math class, because you didn't get to sleep last night and your brain's not going to let you. So I think there is a balance to strike with any kind of use of biology, honestly. I have nothing more to say other than like, you could always fall into that pitfall. So it's important to reflect on it.
One more question that's online.
Yeah.
All right, so this question is from Caroline, and they asked, thank you so much for this presentation. I work for the Community College's Alumni Affairs and Development Office, and I'm interested to know the funding needs of our faculty. You mentioned that you would like to scale this program. What type of funding would you need to do that? And are there any other funding needs you have for your work?
Wow, that is the best question ever.
We saved the best one.
Yes, Caroline. Hit me up. The answer is yes, Caroline. I think we need funding for a lot of things. One is definitely to get more graduate student supports and get people in there. Another one that's huge is the Interactive Brain Museum. Again, we're really, really interested in we want to develop community, which means in location, and having places where our partners and the children and their family members can really come through and enjoy that third space. That's also a place where we want to really do something. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could do, especially on the neuroeducation front, and being able to do some consulting that involves money, that involves people and staffing. So hit me up, Caroline. MZG5 at cornell.edu.
I was just gonna say, you forgot the net ID. Make sure she can email you. All right, so we're at 1 o'clock. That is time for that, but thank you to Marlen. Let's thank Marlen for the presentation.
Thank you, guys.